Hello everyone, this is Stephen Walther Media, and this video will be going over my Unreal 4 Zelda fan project. If you have no idea what I'm talking about and are wondering where these images are coming from, I'll link a source video in the description below if you want to check it out. So before I get started, I would like to preface that this is not a tutorial. This is more of a showcase for my portfolio. A lot of people were also curious on how much work I actually did versus how much was ripped models that were repurposed and just thrown into the Unreal Engine. So what I'd like to go over first are the things I 100% did not make and were just repurposed assets. So first off, this grass and these flowers were taken directly from the kite demo that is available on the Unreal Marketplace for free. The only thing I did was open the textures in Photoshop and mess with some of the coloring. Second, this castle right here is a direct rip from the GameCube source of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. And finally, this torch here was a rip from the 3DS remake of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time from Ganon's Tower. The particle effect on top, however, is not. So that's everything that was 100% not my work. The one other asset that was a model rip was the wolf himself. However, that went through a bunch of modifications and tweaks that I will now go over in detail. So first off is the 3D model. The model on the right is the rip from the GameCube version, and the model on the left is my quote-unquote makeover, HD makeover, which is basically me going through and upping the poly count and just adding more to the outline so you can get a more smooth silhouette. And also did smaller things like increase the cuts on the teeth, add more definition on the nose and the ears, the earring. Another thing I did on the final model was actually have real eyes that are capable of rotating instead of just having a texture. As well as adding a lot more cuts on the chain and the little cuff right here on the side. And of course adding more detail on the paws and adding actual claws instead of just having it be a part of texture. One thing I am doing is I preserved the UVs, so it is actually using the same texture as you can see here. Let me just turn off the wireframe. So the texture is the same, and I use that for the coloring of the fur, which I will go into detail later. Another thing I did was remove the polygon fur. As you can see, there's a bunch of polygons extruding out to give the semblance of fur, and the big one is the hair on the top. I removed all of that with the exception of the one on his chin, just to preserve the outline, so I can go back in and add a more modern interpretation of fur, at least when it comes to Unreal. So what I did next was rig the wolf from the ground up, which includes weight painting and all that fun stuff. So this character is like fully rigged, and not much to say here outside of going into more detail, but everything is here and everything is capable of moving around and animating. With the exception of the tail, there's no controls here because that will be done dynamically, as well as this chain here. Next up, I animated the wolf, obviously. There are a total of 22 animations, which isn't a whole lot, but there are a lot of things that are mixing on top of each other and, like I said earlier, done dynamically in the Unreal Engine. So next up is the fur solution, which I mentioned earlier. What I used was the NeoFur plugin, which was created by the community for Unreal Engine 4. You can check out their website, neoglyphic.com/neofur. Basically, it is a overlapping shell solution, similar to how the fur was done in Shadow of the Colossus way back on the PS2, but of course done with a little more tech now because we have the power to do so. The quote-unquote mane on his head needed a different technique because it is too long to use the NeoFur plugin. I used the built-in hair shaders that were used in Epic's Paragon game, albeit nowhere near as good looking as these photoreal images. When it came to actually interpreting what that stuff on his head was, I originally thought it was some sort of like Twilight tentacle carapace thing that you see in a bunch of other enemy designs. Some other people told me that they were like dreadlocks, but looking at some of the official artwork, it makes it seem as if it is actually clumps of straight hair And when you look at the 3D model up close, you'll actually see a bunch of lines in the texture, which seems to be representative of straight hair, so that's what I went ahead with. When it comes to the actual application of these game mechanics, there are a few things I will go into more detail, sure, but the majority of these features I will only lightly touch on because tutorials on how to create these features are free and in abundance on the Unreal website and on YouTube. When it comes to big budget video games, a feature that is expected is inverse kinematics, so I decided to implement that. Also, because this is a four-legged character, I made the model rotate slightly to match the angle of the surface he is standing on. Mixed with the IK gives off a pretty natural look. I also put in a simple method where the character's head rotates to look at what the camera is pointing at. This is as easy as getting the rotation of the camera relative to the character and adding it to the neck and headphones in the character's skeleton. While it is simple, it does do a very good job of just adding that much more immersion into your game. As I mentioned earlier, both the tail and the chain are simulated in real time using Unreal 4's dynamic physics asset tool. As you can see, I'm only having the tail be influenced by 50%, as it is a bit jittery otherwise. One thing I really wanted to improve upon was making the mane on his head and his ears actually bend and flap around in real time. I achieved this with a combination of anim dynamics, which was also a technique used in Paragon, and spring controllers, also known as jiggle physics, popularized by the Dead or Alive franchise. Each individual clump of hair and ear have their own independent system dedicated to it. It's a bit expensive on the processing side, but in the end it's worth it. The auto jump was actually pretty easy to create. All I did was have the system check if you're in the air or not. As soon as it detects that you aren't, it launches you up and forward. To add a little bit of control in the air, it will actually cancel out your forward velocity when you hold the joystick in the opposite direction you are moving, allowing you to be a little more precise with your jumps. Now, the big mechanic that took up the bulk of the 3-week development period, yes, this entire demo only took 3 weeks by myself, I'm really damn proud of that, I want to make sure you know that, was the climbing mechanic. Long story short, there is a ray that checks in front of the character at all times, visualized by this laser pointer looking thing. When it hits an object, it then fires a second ray above the character at a downward angle. It will then compare the angle of the surfaces that it hits. If it's within 60 and 160 degrees, I think, it will then fire off the rest of the logic, which moves the character to the edge while playing the climbing animation and a couple other things. A minor variant of this applies when the character is in the middle of jumping. Now, one problem that came up was, what do I do when the wolf is only partially on a platform? This is present in a lot of games, but since most characters are bipedal, it isn't that glaring of an issue. A quadruped, however, is much longer in length, so the problem is much more noticeable. I reused some logic that was already in place for the inverse kinematics and detect if each individual foot is colliding with the ground. If it isn't, then it will automatically move the character away from the edge, in a way that doesn't interrupt with normal gameplay. So that's everything, I think, for the actual gameplay mechanics and the creation of the wolf character. What I want to do now is go over the rest of the art, mostly the environment art. First up is the actual modular approach to the level design. There is a beautiful article up on Gamasutra written by Joel Burgess, who is a senior designer at Bethesda Game Studios. I'll link you in the description if you want to check it out. The article goes over, in great detail, the approach to modular level design that they use for Skyrim. If you don't know, it involves creating a bunch of pieces that you snap together like Lego bricks. A project can have hundreds, if not thousands of these pieces, so organization is very important. I applied what I learned from going over this article for this demo, although I only needed to build 50 pieces because the length of the demo is kind of on the short side. The material system I created for these modular pieces take advantage of Unreal 4's vertex painting tools. What it allows me to do is paint on textures that I have set in the material to keep the textures from becoming visually tiled. The textures I can paint using this example are moss, mud, and running water. Using a combination of all of these tools and skills I just went over, I am able to create some decent looking levels in a relatively short amount of time. The water material used in this project uses Unreal's refraction and depth fading to get some pretty cool looking water. There isn't anything dynamic to it, but I did set up a physical material system so particles will spawn when you run through it, as well as playing the correct audio. The trees I modeled in hand in Blender. The textures of the leaves and branches I created in Photoshop and then mapped on top of a bunch of cards, which I then dispersed through the tree model. For the material, I took advantage of subsurface scattering so you can get the proper effect of light filtering through the leaves. For the overall look of the scene, I used a combination of bloom, distance and height fog, film grain, particle effects, motion blur, and color correction to imitate what the Twilight Realm looks like in the source material. And I guess that's everything. Special shout out to Iceferno Remixes for this track playing in the background. There are a few other features I could go over, but I don't want to make the video too long. I hope you enjoyed watching, and until next time.